Nintendo Labo is a brilliant idea, at least on paper. Somehow transforming mere sheets of cardboard into these incredibly intricate contraptions is nothing short of magical. And yet, it hasn't quite found its footing in the marketplace, whether due to a high price, the lacking replayability, or maybe it just being a fundamentally flawed idea. Whatever the case may be, Nintendo's back to give it one more try with the most ambitious Labo kit yet, Labo VR Kit. And what really sets this one apart from the others is that the VR goggles aren't just simulating a real-life device, it actually is a real-life VR device. And as such, it's pretty much impossible to convey the sensation of what it's like to use them in video form. So keep that in mind as I try to paint a picture as best as I can as to what it's like to actually use Labo VR. Okay, so the Labo VR Kit isn't just another Labo product, as it's also Nintendo's first proper foray into the increasingly competitive and expensive VR space. And even though Nintendo's version doesn't appear to be a full VR platform, at least not yet, it's still undercutting most of the competition as an entry point by hundreds of dollars, with a starter kit which comes with just the goggles and blaster available for a mere $40, or $80 if you want the entire VR package, which also includes the elephant, bird, camera, and wind pedal Toy-Cons. So yeah, it's a pretty cheap entry point into the world of VR, assuming you already own a Nintendo Switch of course. Now, as one who's had a fair amount of playtime in VR between the room-scale Vive and the smaller-scale PlayStation VR, I was extremely curious as to how Labo VR would compare, if it can at all. I mean, can Labo VR even get close in a technological sense? And just as importantly, does it bring anything to the table that other VR devices don't, besides a lower price tag? Well, you might be surprised by some of my answers, because I sure was. Regardless of which VR kit you choose, your VR journey will begin by building the VR goggles, which are the gateway to pretty much every experience in the VR kit, as it connects directly into the Toy-Cons themselves. Now, while the goggles only took me about 45 minutes to make, which the game walks you through step by step by the way, the remainder of the Toy-Cons weren't quite as quick, with most of them taking anywhere from an hour to put together, like the bird, all the way up to 3 hours or so for the blaster. Altogether, the 6 Toy-Cons in the full set took me 9 hours to assemble. It can get pretty intense. So I definitely recommend spreading it out over the course of a few days and enjoying the Toy-Cons as you build them. And even though I've now gone through 4 of these Labo kits, the process of assembling them yourself still impresses, even if it is starting to get a little bit repetitive after building a dozen Toy-Cons. But hey, if this is your first kit, that won't be an issue. So that's the Labo side of things, but what about the VR side? Well, let's get the basics out of the way. Labo VR is an inherently limited device. The Switch's screen resolution is relatively low, it lacks comprehensive head and body tracking, and it doesn't even have a head strap. Instead, you have to hold the whole thing to your face the entire time. And then there's a little fact that pretty much the entire thing is made out of cardboard. How serious of a VR device can it really be? Well, the magic of Labo VR is how Nintendo works within those very limitations to create a compelling gameplay experience. Because almost from the very moment I first stuck my face into the visor and gripped one of the Toy-Cons, my concerns just faded away as I was absorbed into a variety of virtual worlds, all brought to life in Nintendo's characteristic colorful fashion. Whether defending a city from an alien invasion, or deep-sea diving to snap some underwater pictures, or even racing through the skies while riding Birdback, the effect was the same: near total immersion. It felt surprisingly real, sometimes even in ways that other VR devices don't quite replicate. And it achieves this via a few clever methods. One, Labo VR is designed entirely as a seated experience, which naturally limits your range of motion and helps mitigate the lack of full body tracking. So for this reason, a chair that can spin, like an office chair, or at least one without a back, is ideal for the more 360-degree oriented games. Secondly, rather than using a single generic controller across every game, you'll instead use a variety of Toy-Cons tailor-made for each one. And this is where the uniqueness of Labo VR lies. Because instead of pointing a tiny Joy-Con at the invading aliens, you're aiming an entire bazooka, in which you physically feel the recoil of every shot thanks to an incredibly clever design involving a cardboard weight and rubber bands. Or when taking pictures underwater, you'll physically hold a camera in which you rotate the lens to zoom in and out for the perfect picture. Or how when flying as a bird, you'll physically flap its wings to gain speed while tilting the entire body to turn. Oh, and then there's a wind pedal Toy-Con, so called because, as you might have guessed, it generates a gust of air every time it's pressed. Okay, now I know it might look like peak gimmick, but you know what? It totally works! And I kind of love it! Stomping on that stupid pedal really helps sell the idea that was a frog leaping off the ground, and then the gush of air hits you right in the face while flying upward, completing the illusion. It might look silly, and let's be real, it looks really silly, but it works. Shockingly well. After just a few leaps, it really felt as if I jumped the height of a skyscraper, an illusion that feels distressingly convincing if you decide to look down. Whoa! The tactile nature of the Toy-Cons helps to create a wonderful sense of presence. Sure, Labo VR may not have true one-to-one hand tracking, but it sure does feel like it with how the in-game contraptions perfectly mirror your handling of the real-life Toy-Con. Whether it's seeing the pump action of the blaster in action as you prepare your next shot, or a bird flapping its wings exactly as you do. Yeah, it's not conventional one-to-one motion tracking, and yet it kind of is in its own unique way. And heck, one of those Toy-Cons actually does enable true one-to-one hand tracking. Well, for one hand at least. Through a combination of an elephant mask and a Joy-Con equipped trunk, the Elephant Toy-Con allows you to reposition objects or create paintings in the full 360-degree 3D space with remarkable precision. It's incredibly clever how it works, and that it even works at all. And it might just be the single most impressive Toy-Con from a technology standpoint, as it basically allows you to play with a simpler version of paint programs on more advanced VR devices like Vive's Tilt Brush. It is so cool being able to paint in the air using pinpoint precision, including angle and distance. Now of course, you can't walk around your creations on Switch due to the lack of room scale tracking, but you are able to pick the entire thing up and move it around as you wish. The Toy-Cons really do add a sense of physicality and feedback that VR so often lacks. You actually feel the weight of the blaster, as well as the recoil from its shots, or the satisfying click of rotating a camera lens. And of course, the rushing air of the wind pedal that I just can't get enough of. It actually reminded me of the 4D effects you'd find on some Disneyland rides, which of course is pretty much a gold standard when it comes to immersive forms of entertainment. Except in this case, instead of riding on the back of a banshee from Avatar, you're riding on the saddle of a cute little bird. Aww. And believe me when I say that racing as that bird in the Bird Dash game actually does feel like an amusement park ride, as you're turning and twisting around tight corners and flying down mountainsides. And the fact that it's compatible with the wind pedal is even better, as it gives you a burst of speed and air with each press. It is ridiculously exhilarating. Just look at us go! The Toy-Cons work alongside the VR goggles to create a wonderful sense of presence. I was afraid that Nintendo's take on VR would feel like a mere toy, like one of these viewfinders. Instead, I was elated to find out that the goggles provide an impressively wide window into the virtual world, and it felt comparable to other VR headsets like PlayStation VR. Fighting a giant enemy crab that towers over you is intimidating, and it's a little freaky to find yourself face to face with a giant shark, especially when you forget to zoom out using the camera. Labo VR allows for a sense of scale that rivals the very best VR platforms. Now, one area the Labo VR doesn't quite compete in is in image quality, especially on paper. After all, the Switch's display is only 720p, as compared to PlayStation VR's 1080p display, and that goes even higher for other devices. Which means the screen door effect is noticeably more pronounced here than on most other headsets. You might also see a shimmering effect around the edges of some objects due to the low resolution, which also renders distant objects a bit blurry, as if they were out of focus. There is also a distinct motion blur-like effect when making quick turns, which I'm not entirely sure if that was intentional or a side effect of the Switch's refresh rate. In any case, I was surprised to find out how little any of that mattered. The screen quality here is more than adequate for the experiences Nintendo has paired with them, with each one generally consisting of bright colors and a high contrast, making most everything pretty easy to read at a glance, which has often been an issue in some other VR games. The head tracking also feels incredibly precise when looking around, matching your movement nearly one-to-one. It's close enough that I was able to spin around multiple times and still end up facing the same direction in the real world as in the virtual one. Now, it isn't absolutely perfect because gyroscopes inherently drift, but it was really only an issue with games that use the wind pedal, as you'll occasionally find yourself growing misaligned with it after a few minutes. But thankfully, it only takes a quick press of the pause button to instantly recalibrate the screen to your centered position. Now, one major concern that's plagued VR devices since their inception is the potential for feeling motion sickness, as even a slight mismatch between what you're seeing and what you're feeling can cause issues. But based on my extensive playtime with Labo VR, I never felt any untoward symptoms myself, but I am also pretty resistant to motion sickness in general. Except when it comes to that freaking Harry Potter ride. I don't know what it's doing, but whoa, I did not feel good coming off of it. Now, the butterbeer I can deal with, multiple times. Anyways, point is that motion sickness is a very subjective experience. It affects different people in different ways for different reasons. And it's exactly for that reason that I tested it out with a few other people, including 2 adults and 2 children. And for 3 of them, they didn't experience any issues at all. But the 4th did feel a little lightheaded when turning too quickly in the Hop Dodge Frog game, as well as when he found himself a little too immersed in the doodle mode and attempted to walk around to view his creation from a different perspective, which of course won't work. So yeah, stay seated kids. Now, even though I didn't experience any motion sickness myself, I did suffer from at least one physical symptom. My arms did get pretty tired holding the various Toy-Cons and VR goggles to my face for more than a few moments at a time. It isn't exactly the most ergonomic setup for play sessions longer than a few minutes. But you know what, I was having so much fun, I didn't let that stop me either. So just make sure to give your arms a break every few minutes. Furthermore, Nintendo recommends that Labo VR only be used by children 7 years old or up, at least in VR mode. But fortunately, Labo VR supports the ability to play without VR at all, allowing you to plug just the Switch itself into any of the Toy-Cons for some 2D action. And this could also be a good solution for those more susceptible to motion sickness. But you would obviously be missing out on the primary appeal of, you know, virtual reality. Now, one of the bigger problems with the previous Labo kits has been replayability, or the lack thereof, especially with the first two being Variety and Robot, as each of the Toy-Cons only offered simple tasks that provided maybe a few minutes of fun, if that, and there was little reason to revisit them once the novelty wore off. And that's a bit of a problem when you consider the price, as well as the hours spent building each of the Toy-Cons. It kind of sucks when you spend more time building Labo than actually playing with it. Thankfully, Labo VR is the best value yet, despite also being the most expensive at $80 if you want the full set. Because this time, each Toy-Con comes with at least one proper modestly sized game, in addition to a bonus side mode or two, making for around 9 games total of varying lengths. You can expect around an hour of gameplay for most of the mission-based ones, like the Blaster, Bird, Marble Run, and Ocean Camera, whereas some others are a bit shorter, like Bird Dash and Hop Dodge, which maybe took me 20 minutes to complete each one. But that's not even factoring in how replayable some of them can be, like going for a higher score in Blaster, or a faster time in Bird Dash, or just seeing how high you can make it in Hop Dodge's unlockable challenge mode. And then we have the Elephant Toy-Con's Doodle mode, which obviously will last as long as you want to paint for, and you can even save your best creations. There's also a couple of 2-player games too, in which you pass the VR goggles back and forth. In Guess the Doodle, you'll have to guess what the other player drew, although I found this mode a little bit too easy to guess since you can only choose from one of 4 answers. So the real star of the multiplayer show is Hungry Hungry Hippos, I meant Kablasta, in which you take turns sucking up various fruits and shoot them at a pool full of hungry hippos, in order to lure them over to your side of the pond. And this game has a surprising amount of depth, between the different fruit properties like watermelons that can explode like a grenade, or trying to target specific hippos based on their food preferences, or even trying to feed hippos already on your opponent's side to lure them over to your own. It really is a lot of fun, and surprisingly strategic too. In fact, I thoroughly enjoyed almost every mode in the game, with my personal favorites being wrecking aliens in Blaster and racing through narrow corridors in Bird Dash. Also, while I enjoyed the mission structure of Ocean Camera, which tasks you with taking specific pictures of particular fish and other underwater oddities, I did find the similar setup for House Camera to be a little tedious, as it's far too dependent on randomness and trial and error to uncover all the creature's secret poses. Finally, beyond the 9 main modes, there's also a little something called VR Plaza, which contains 64 bite-sized experiences created by Nintendo themselves using Labo's built-in Garage Mode editor. As in, these are all games that you can even build yourself using the remarkable powerful toolset. Things like a fully featured pinball table or a music room where you can play with various instruments. It's all incredibly impressive, and each one provides at least a few minutes of bite-sized fun. And when you're done, you can load them up in the Garage editor yourself to see exactly how they work, and then modify them yourself to make all new challenges. I really can't overstate how incredibly powerful the editor appears to be, allowing you to create a hugely diverse range of possibilities. Unfortunately, all that power comes at the expense of usability, as the editor isn't especially user-friendly, and I sadly didn't have enough time prior to this review to fully understand it myself. But it does seem pretty clear that if you have time to invest into it, you can make some incredibly cool things, which is why it's a shame that there's no way to share them with the outside world, as there is absolutely zero online functionality. And this really kneecaps the Garage's potential. What could have been an amazingly vibrant community built around sharing VR games is instead a sadly lonely venture. And it really makes one wonder whether it's even worth learning the editor in the first place if no one can play with your creations. Maybe an update could address this in the future, but I'm not holding my breath. Oh, and I nearly forgot to mention the adorable selection of VR videos, which allows you to freely look around while a pre-recorded segment plays out in front of you. Whether it's Mario playing a trick on you, or watching someone feed a ton of deer, they're all super cute and well worth the 20 minutes or so it will take to watch them all. Taken all together, there is a pretty impressive amount of content in Labo VR, especially when compared to the previous Labo kits. And they're also quite a bit more enjoyable this time too, which inherently makes them more replayable as well. I don't know if I'll ever get tired of swooping through the skies in Bird Dash. Finally, let's talk about the general form factor, which has its own pros and cons. On the upside, I truly love that it's a self-contained apparatus, making it an inherently simpler device to play with compared to other VR headsets. Let me tell you, after setting up a PlayStation VR and its seemingly dozens of cables, it's refreshing to play with a VR device that doesn't require any at all. It is literally plug and play. After you build it, of course. You won't have to worry about cords getting tangled or sideline issues with the motion controllers. It just works, outside of having to occasionally put it down to recalibrate the gyroscope. But it's a process that only takes a few seconds. In addition, I like how easy it is to pop in and out of VR, as you literally just hold the goggles to your face, which is especially great in a group setting for sharing with friends. But at the same time, it's a bit unfortunate that there's no way to output the picture to the TV so that your friends can see what you're doing in VR at the same time. And then there's the issue of your arms getting tired that I mentioned before, which can be a bit annoying. Okay, so to wrap things up, Labo VR is straight up some of the most fun I've had on Nintendo Switch yet. It builds upon the brilliant concept of creating incredibly intricate contraptions out of cardboard and cranks it up to 11. By having you use them within a convincingly real virtual world, full of fun and exciting challenges. Labo VR may not be the most technologically advanced VR device, but it might just be the most fun one out of the box, as it doesn't feel held back by its limitations. And then there's the fact that the Toy-Cons add a unique immersive element that you won't find on any other VR platform. But hey, you don't have to take my word for it, because here's what my nieces had to say. So what do you like about it so much?
Everything.
Is it because like it feels real? Like did it feel like it's right there?
I took it off on accident and I was like, oh my god, I'm not used to this. Put it back on. That was awesome.
Labo VR really feels like the culmination of most of Nintendo's video game history. It takes the ambitions of the Virtual Boy, adds in the motion controls of the Wii, the enhanced reality of the 3DS's 3D screen, the extended world view offered by the Wii U's gamepad, and combines it with the build-it-yourself nature of Labo, as well as Nintendo's 40-year history of making games, in order to deliver something as truly impressive as an entry point for VR, while also being uniquely Nintendo. Don't let the relatively low price fool you. Labo VR is a legitimate VR experience, even if it isn't a full VR platform. And that raises the question of what's next for Labo VR. After all, Nintendo has already announced upcoming support for Super Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild. But are those just one-off exceptions, or could more VR support be on the way? It's impossible to say for now, but even as a self-contained experience, Labo VR is something that I thoroughly loved, eliciting a childlike wonder that I hadn't felt in gaming in quite some time. And I can only imagine how much I will have completely lost my mind playing with it as a kid. Now if you'll excuse me, I have to go back to racing on the back of a saddled bird. Thanks for watching, and make sure to click that subscribe button for tons more on Labo VR and everything else Nintendo Switch as well. We'll catch you later. Bye.